Emma Jenkins was the perfect wife, graceful, loyal, and unwavering through 20 years of marriage to Daniel, a rising star in Boston's legal world. Behind their polished life lay quiet sacrifices and invisible wounds, the kind a woman endures in silence. Then came the blow, a cancer diagnosis she hadn't yet processed, when Daniel blindsided her with 7 cold words: "I need space. I want a divorce." As she faced treatment alone, he celebrated an engagement with his much younger secretary, at the very cottage Emma once called home. But he didn't know one thing: his father's will held a secret clause that would change everything. What unfolds next is not revenge, but a meticulously quiet reckoning. What happens when the woman you discarded becomes the one holding the pen to your future? Where are you watching this video from? Drop your location in the comments below. And don't forget to buckle up. This story is just getting started. The gravel crunched beneath the tires of Emma Walker's rental car as she turned into the long, winding driveway of Lakeview Cottage. The summer air was thick with the scent of wildflowers and fresh-cut grass, a cruel contrast to the tension that coiled in her stomach. Up ahead, white lanterns swayed lazily from tree branches, strung like careless promises across the yard. Classical music drifted toward her, delicate and practiced. A photographer orchestrated couples into smiling formations near the dock. For anyone watching, it was a perfect day. Emma parked between a black Escalade and a silver BMW. She sat still for a moment, one hand resting on the envelope in her purse, the other gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles turned pale. Through the windshield she could see clusters of elegantly dressed guests. Old colleagues, familiar faces, neighbors who once shared summer barbecues and laughter with her and Daniel. Now they toasted him and another woman. Emma stepped out of the car with measured grace. She wore a slate blue dress that hugged her figure modestly, a nod to quiet power rather than ostentation. Her silver-streaked hair was cut into a sharp bob, the strands glinting in the afternoon light. She moved slowly, deliberately, as if walking through fog that only she could see. A few heads turned. Conversations hiccuped, then resumed. But one face froze. Jessica Monroe's carefully curated smile faltered as her eyes locked onto Emma. She whispered something to the man beside her, Daniel Walker, who turned with visible annoyance, only to stop short when he saw his ex-wife approaching. "Emma," he said, forcing a smile, the muscles around his mouth barely cooperating. "This is unexpected." Emma didn't blink. "Hello, Daniel," she replied smoothly. "Jessica, congratulations on your engagement." Jessica's fingers tightened around Daniel's arm. The string quartet faltered, then recovered. Conversations dimmed to a hush. "Perhaps we could speak in private," Daniel murmured, already steering her away from the gathering. Emma shook her head. "Oh, I won't be staying long," she said lightly. "I just wanted to deliver something in person." She reached into her purse and pulled out the envelope. Daniel made no move to take it. His eyes darted across the crowd like a cornered animal. "What is it?" Jessica asked, her voice slightly shrill. Emma held the envelope between them. "Just a copy of something Daniel should have read years ago. Your future father-in-law's will. Specifically, the clause regarding divorce." Daniel's expression cracked. "What clause?" Emma removed the notarized document and unfolded it with care. The official seal gleamed under the dappled light. 6 years ago, George updated his will. He added a moral clause. "It states clearly that if you initiated divorce proceedings against me without evidence of infidelity on my part, you forfeit your entire inheritance." Jessica lunged for the document, her manicured nails creasing the edge. She scanned the lines, her face draining of color. "This can't be legal," she snapped. "Tell her this isn't legal." But Daniel was no longer looking at her. His eyes were fixed on the document, the truth crashing down around him like breaking glass. "My father would never." "He did," Emma interrupted, her voice calm. "Because he saw what you were capable of even before I did." Gasps echoed from nearby. Diane Harris, an old family friend, clutched her champagne flute with both hands. Several of Daniel's senior partners had begun to edge closer, brows furrowed with concern. Emma took a step back and looked around the garden, letting the silence stretch. "Everything," she continued, "from his shares in the firm to this cottage to the investment accounts, it all reverts to the charity of George's choosing, unless you can prove I was unfaithful." Jessica turned on Daniel, voice sharp with betrayal. You said everything was taken care of. You promised me. Emma tucked the document back into her bag and gave Daniel a final look. Measured, steady. I thought you deserved some warning. And of course my congratulations. Then she turned. The commotion behind her faded with each step. Jessica's shrill accusations. Daniel's half-hearted attempts to explain. The stunned murmurs of guests caught in the wake of a scandal they hadn't seen coming. Emma reached her car and slid behind the wheel, her heartbeat steady. As she glanced in the rearview mirror, she caught one last glimpse of Lakeview Cottage. The lanterns swayed as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed. She didn't look back. When Daniel's world fell apart in a single afternoon, it was the echo of a reckoning set in motion 6 months earlier. A reckoning born not of revenge, but of quiet strategy and a truth no longer hidden. And everything had started with 3 life-altering blows that arrived in succession, tearing open the illusion she once called marriage. 6 months earlier, Emma Walker sat on the edge of a cold examination table in a room painted the color of artificial calm, mint green. A motivational poster about courage hung crookedly on the wall, its bright font now an unfunny joke. Dr. Owens, with her firm but gentle voice, delivered the news Emma never expected to hear. Stage 2 breast cancer. It had been caught early. Surgery and radiation offered a strong prognosis. But the diagnosis landed like a punch to the ribs. Not because of the illness itself but because of its timing. Emma had just turned 48. She'd spent 2 decades holding together a life that revolved not around her own ambitions, but around Daniel's, her husband, her partner, or so she had believed. 4 years she had balanced charity galas, networking dinners, and countless invisible responsibilities that kept their high society image spotless. Now, just as her own body began to betray her, she realized something else had been slipping away long before the cells turned against her. Her marriage. That day she drove home in silence, trying to rehearse the words. She told herself to stay rational, to be calm the way Daniel always preferred. No emotion. No mess. Just facts. But when she pulled into the driveway, the house was dark. A text message popped up seconds later. Working late. Don't wait up. The 3rd time that week. Emma stood in the foyer, her purse still on her shoulder, and felt something unfamiliar settle in her chest. Not sadness. Not yet. Something colder. Something like clarity. She made tea, sat alone at the kitchen island, and stared at the marble countertop they'd chosen together during their 10th anniversary renovation. She traced the subtle veins in the stone and wondered when their home had stopped being a refuge. When it had become a showroom instead. When she had stopped being a partner and started becoming a piece of decor that matched the drapes. The signs were there. Daniel's wardrobe had transformed overnight. Designer suits, expensive new cologne, a gym membership he finally used. Conversations became brief and transactional. He'd started critiquing her in subtle, cutting ways. Too quiet at dinner parties. Too tired in the evenings. Too distracted, too much, not enough. One night, he flinched slightly when she reached for his hand under the table. It was small, but she noticed. She had chalked it up to stress. His recent promotion to senior partner brought long hours and mounting pressure. Emma had done what she always did, absorbed the burden quietly. She scheduled the dinners, sent thank you notes, kept up appearances. Even when he pulled away, she had filled in the gaps. Because that's what you do when you're part of a team. Even if you're the only one still playing. The next morning, she attempted a conversation over breakfast. Daniel didn't look up from his phone. I thought we could talk about something important, she said. Can it wait? I've got court in an hour. So she waited. She waited through days of silence. Through another week of late nights and vague excuses. She waited through her first oncology appointment, alone. Sat in the parking lot afterward, her skin still prickling from the needle of the biopsy, and reminded herself that she was strong. Independent. Not abandoned. But the lie thinned each time Daniel chose elsewhere over her. She noticed other things. Charges on their credit card for jewelry stores she'd never visited. Intimate restaurants far from the financial district. Lipstick, burnt rose, not her color, on the collar of a crisp white shirt. She pressed her fingers to her temple and willed herself not to jump to conclusions. But the puzzle pieces were snapping into place whether she wanted them to or not. Then came the dinner invitation. Daniel suggested they go to Brigham House, an upscale restaurant they'd visited on anniversaries past. "There's something important we need to talk about," he'd said in a tone that struck her as both rehearsed and formal. For the first time in weeks, Emma felt a flicker of hope. Maybe her illness had made him see what mattered. Maybe this was their turning point. She chose a navy wrap dress that masked her recent weight loss and called her sister Claire for support. She even told her for the first time about the cancer. "He's finally noticing," Emma said, the phone warm against her cheek. "Maybe this is what we needed." There was a pause on the line. "Emma," Claire said carefully, "are you sure that's what he wants to talk about?" Emma brushed it off. He had to believe 20 years counted for something. She had to believe that whatever had gone wrong could be repaired. And yet, as she stood in front of the mirror applying concealer beneath tired eyes, she couldn't shake the creeping sensation that this night wasn't about healing. It was about ending. Because while Emma was preparing to save a marriage, Daniel was preparing to end it. And that night would deliver the final blow. 2 days after signing the divorce papers, Emma sat on the shaded porch of Mercer's Cafe in Vermont. A cool breeze moved gently through the late spring air, ruffling the napkin folded neatly on her lap. Across from her, George Walker, the man who had been more of a father to her than her own, methodically buttered a piece of toast. His hands, though aged, were steady, deliberate. Emma watched him, remembering the countless lunches they'd shared in this very spot over the years. But today was different. Today silence carried weight. George set down his knife and looked at her, not with pity but with something else, resolve. "Daniel told me about the divorce," he said simply. "Yesterday." Emma nodded. "Did he tell you why?" George exhaled, long and tired. "He gave me some nonsense about growing apart. But I've seen the way he looks at that woman from his office." They sat in the quiet that follows truth. It wasn't awkward, just familiar. Two people mourning the same loss in different ways. The clatter of dishes and the hum of low conversation from nearby tables faded into the background. Emma reached for her coffee. "I wanted to tell you myself, but I wasn't sure how." George looked at her for a long moment. "Emma, I need to tell you something. And I need you to hear it with an open mind." She nodded. 6 years ago, after Margaret, my wife, passed, I made changes to my will. At the time Daniel was still tolerable. But even then I saw how he treated you. How he took you for granted. And I knew," he paused, "that one day he might decide you weren't part of his plan anymore." Emma swallowed. "What did you do?" George leaned in slightly. "I added a clause to my estate. A moral clause. My lawyer called it rare but not unprecedented. It states that if Daniel ever divorces you, unless you were the one unfaithful or abusive, he forfeits his entire inheritance. The business. The lake house. The investment accounts. All of it." Emma blinked, stunned. "Why?" "Because I've seen too many men my age throw away good women. Women who built the very foundations they now stand on. And I wasn't going to let Daniel do that without consequence." Emma looked away, eyes damp. "Does he know?" "No," George said, a sad smile on his face. He never read the full document. Too busy climbing to care about the terms beneath his feet. He let the weight of it settle in. Not revenge. Not cruelty. But protection. Quiet, deliberate protection from a man who had always seen her worth. "Is the clause enforceable?" she asked. George nodded. "My lawyer ensured it was airtight. And I have a certified copy for you." He reached into his briefcase and slid the envelope across the table. Emma stared at it, the paper thinner than it should have been for something so heavy. "You don't have to use it," he said softly. "But if the time comes, and it sounds like it already has, you'll have it." Emma placed her hand on top of the envelope. "Thank you." George covered her hand with his. "You deserve better, Emma. You always did." The lunch ended without fanfare. They spoke about lighter things, local news, the weather. But beneath every word was the unspoken acknowledgement of a power shift neither of them could ignore. Later that evening, Emma sat on her porch in Boston, envelope unopened beside her. She didn't need to look inside to understand what it meant. It was more than a legal safeguard. It was a line in the sand, drawn by someone who had loved her quietly but completely. And in that moment, something inside Emma realigned. Not hope. Not yet. But possibility. Because she now saw the divorce not as abandonment, but as a miscalculation. Daniel believed he had walked away clean. That he had left the past behind with no consequence. But the truth was, The moment he asked for space, he had triggered a clause that would unravel everything he thought was secure. And Emma wouldn't need to fight. She would only need to wait. Because patience, she now understood, was power dressed in silence. And the reckoning had already begun. It started with a name. 1 week after her lunch with George, Emma walked into the county courthouse, a simple manila folder tucked beneath her arm, and quietly reclaimed the identity she'd left behind 20 years earlier. No ceremony. No grand announcement. Just a few pages of paperwork and a brief interaction with a clerk who barely looked up until she saw the signature. Divorce? The woman asked, blunt and matter-of-fact. Emma nodded. Recently. The woman stamped the form with practiced force and offered a rare, knowing smile. Welcome back to yourself, Miss Jenkins. Those words stayed with her. Outside the courthouse, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk. Emma tilted her face to the light, feeling the warmth on her skin, and whispered the name under her breath like a promise. Emma Jenkins. Not someone's wife. Not someone's shadow. Herself. That small act of reclamation unlocked something bigger. Over the next few days, Emma began stitching together the pieces of her life that had long gone dormant. She reached out to Judith Abernathy, her former mentor from the law firm she had once left behind to support Daniel's career. They met at a quiet cafe, the kind of place where polished wood met soft lamplight and conversations didn't need to compete with noise. Judith, as sharp as ever at 75, listened with laser focus as Emma recounted everything. Her diagnosis, the divorce, George's clause, and Daniel's upcoming engagement party. The older woman nodded occasionally, but her expression didn't shift until Emma reached the end. So, Judith said, setting her espresso down, he left you for his secretary. How breathtakingly original. Emma let out a laugh, short, dry, real. Judith leaned forward. And what's your plan now, Emma? Besides making him wish he'd never met you. Emma hesitated, then told her the truth. I don't want revenge. I just want to make sure that what's rightfully mine, what was protected for me, stays untouched. Judith tapped her fingers against the rim of her cup. You need documentation. The clause won't matter unless you can prove it exists and that George was of sound mind when he added it. I have a notarized copy, Emma said. George gave it to me himself. Judith didn't smile, but the approval in her voice was clear. Then we make this ironclad. She pulled out her phone and called a colleague in estate law, setting up a meeting for later that afternoon. Emma followed her to a small office downtown, where they went over every line of the will, confirming its validity, preparing it for formal use if challenged. By the end of the day, Emma held a court-certified, sealed copy of the document. She walked out into the city evening, her heels clicking against the pavement, each step more certain than the last. Meanwhile, life continued to remind her that she hadn't been forgotten. Claire accompanied her to radiation sessions, sometimes just sitting silently in the waiting room, sometimes reading aloud from magazines they both mocked playfully. Michael, a quiet widower from next door, brought over a casserole one evening and awkwardly confessed he had overheard Daniel at the club spinning lies about Emma's mental health. I just wanted you to know, he said, eyes on the floor. You're not crazy. I saw it too. Emma thanked him not just for the food but for the truth. It meant more than he knew. And then came the final signal. A notification lit up on her phone. Jessica Monroe had posted a new photo, her hand adorned with a diamond ring, posed over a white linen table. The caption read, "She said yes," with heart emojis and hashtags about love and new beginnings. But it was the location tag that made Emma sit up straight. Lakeview Cottage. Their old family retreat. The property George had tied to the clause. The very place where Daniel had proposed to her 21 years ago. The betrayal was no longer personal. It was territorial. Emma set her phone down and stood by the window. Outside, the street was quiet. Inside, her mind was not. A storm had gathered, not of anger but of intention. They were planning an engagement party there. In the house that should never be his. In the space Emma had once called a sanctuary. They were claiming it as their new beginning. But it wasn't theirs to take. Not legally. Not morally. She opened her calendar and circled the date. 3 weeks. Just enough time. It was no longer about grief. It was about reclaiming what had been stolen. Not just property, not just dignity, but truth. The time for silence was almost over. And Emma Jenkins was no longer the woman who let others speak first. The day of the engagement party dawned clear and crisp, sunlight stretching across the Vermont hills like a silent invitation. Emma stood before the mirror in her Modeston room, fastening the clasp of a necklace she hadn't worn in years. Her reflection was not the one she remembered from the days of cocktail dresses and charity fundraisers. This woman was leaner, sharper, not in bitterness but in focus. Her slate blue dress, simple yet elegant, framed her silver-streaked bob, each thread of gray a badge of survival rather than age. Beside her on the bed lay the sealed, court-certified copy of George's will, tucked safely in an envelope. Claire sat nearby, watching quietly, a gentle kind of pride in her gaze. "You look powerful," Claire said. "Not angry. Just, sure." Emma smiled, the expression faint but genuine. "I'm not here to make a scene. I'm here to make it clear." The drive to Lakeview Cottage was quiet, the winding road flanked by trees in early bloom. With each curve, a memory flashed, laughter echoing on the lake, George pointing out birds on their dock, even the quiet nights with Daniel before everything corroded under his ambition. As the familiar roofline came into view, now painted a sterile white, Emma pulled over for a breath. Her hands trembled briefly on the steering wheel, but only from the weight of what she was about to do, not fear. "You can do this," she told her reflection in the rearview mirror. And she believed it. She drove the final stretch and parked without fanfare. The long gravel driveway was lined with expensive cars, names and faces she once knew. From the back of the property came the distant murmur of voices, laughter, the gentle pulse of a string quartet. Lanterns swayed gently in the trees. Wait staff in crisp uniforms floated among the crowd with trays of hors d'oeuvres. It could have been any perfect afternoon, except that this was not theirs to claim. Emma walked toward the sound, every step measured, every movement deliberate. She passed familiar faces. Some offered polite nods, others blinked in confusion, unsure if they were seeing a ghost or a memory. A few turned away, feigning distraction. She reached the heart of the garden. White chairs had been arranged in neat rows. Tables glowed with flower arrangements. At the center stood Daniel, polished and confident, his arm curled around Jessica Monroe's waist. They were laughing with a cluster of Daniel's law partners, basking in admiration. Until Jessica spotted her. Emma watched the transformation on her face. The freeze, the alarm, the whispered tug on Daniel's sleeve. He turned, expression shifting from amusement to confusion, then panic. "Emma," he said, voice stiff. "This is unexpected." "Hello, Daniel," she replied with warmth that bordered on ironic. "Jessica, congratulations." Jessica's hand tightened on Daniel's arm. The music stumbled. Conversation quieted. Heads turned. Daniel attempted to steer her aside. "Let's not do this here." "I won't be long," Emma said calmly. "I just came to deliver something." She reached into her purse and produced the envelope. Daniel didn't move. His eyes darted around, calculating witnesses. "What is it?" Jessica asked, voice too high. "Just a copy of something Daniel forgot to read," Emma said. "Your future father-in-law's will. The clause concerning divorce." The crowd went still. Emma unfolded the document slowly, allowing the seal to catch the light. 6 years ago, George added a condition. "If Daniel divorced me without proof of infidelity on my part, he forfeits everything. The shares in the law firm. This cottage. All of it. It reverts to George's selected charity." Jessica snatched the document. Her face turned red as she scanned the lines. "This can't be legal," she snapped. "Daniel, tell her." But Daniel didn't speak. He stared at the document, face pale, lips pressed tight. "He never read the will," Emma said, "because he thought he was above consequence." One of the firm's senior partners stepped forward, frowning. "Mitchell, is this true? Your father's shares." "It's a misunderstanding," Daniel stammered. "There must be a loophole." Emma reclaimed the document, sliding it back into the envelope. "I just thought you deserved to be informed," she said. "Enjoy your afternoon." As she turned, Jessica's voice rose, brittle and panicked. "You promised me. You said it was ours." Emma walked away, the sounds of unraveling behind her, the clink of a dropped glass, the rise of whispers, Jessica's scream tearing through the quiet. She did not look back. Because this wasn't a scene. It was a statement. And the weight that had pressed against her chest for months had finally lifted. Not in triumph, but in peace. She returned to the inn that evening, sat beside the window and watched the last of the sun disappear behind the trees. Her phone buzzed non-stop. She silenced it. The storm had landed. And it had spoken for her. The following evening, Emma sat at a corner table in a small cafe halfway between her new apartment and the place where Daniel now lived alone. The air inside smelled of burnt espresso and old wood, the kind of scent that clings to your clothes but feels oddly familiar. She had arrived 5 minutes early and taken the seat facing the door, her posture composed, her expression unreadable. She didn't sip the coffee in front of her. She was saving her voice. Daniel entered right on time. He looked diminished. His usual polish had vanished. His navy jacket was wrinkled at the shoulders and his once sharp collar slouched near his neck. A line of stubble shadowed his jaw. He saw her and hesitated, then approached with the awkwardness of a man no longer certain of his place. "Emma," he said, unsure whether to sit or apologize first. She nodded toward the chair opposite her. "Thank you for coming," he added, settling in. "What did you want to discuss?" Her tone was neutral, firm, not unkind. Daniel wrapped both hands around his coffee cup, though it was too hot to drink. "Jessica's gone," he said after a long silence. "She left the night of the party. Threw the ring into the lake. Told me she never wanted to see me again." Emma said nothing. She waited. "The firm asked me to take a leave of absence," he continued. "They're reviewing my financial situation. The board is concerned about exposure." She nodded once, slowly, letting it land. "My father's not answering my calls," he added. He sent word through his attorney. "I'm cut off until further notice. The inheritance, the accounts, frozen." His voice cracked. Then his eyes met hers, something bitter and ragged inside them. "You destroyed everything." Emma leaned forward slightly, but her expression didn't change. "No, Daniel. You did that yourself. I just stopped protecting you from it." The waitress approached, sensed the tension and backed away without asking for their order. Daniel's hands were shaking now. He blinked quickly and ran one palm across his mouth. "Why didn't you tell me about the clause?" he asked, quieter now. "All those weeks of the divorce. You could have said something." Emma tilted her head, measuring him. "Would it have changed anything? Would you have stayed?" He didn't answer. He couldn't. "I didn't hold it back to hurt you," she said. "I held it because I was done carrying your decisions. And I wasn't going to give you the satisfaction of seeing me beg to be treated with decency." She let the silence breathe between them. Daniel leaned back, looking as though the chair no longer supported him. "I don't know who I am anymore," he said. Emma took a long breath. Then she straightened her shoulders. "There's one more thing you should know." His head lifted, alarmed. "I have cancer. Breast cancer. Stage 2. I was diagnosed 3 weeks before you asked for a divorce. I tried to tell you at Giovanni's that night, but you were already halfway through your speech." Daniel stared, mouth parted. Shock froze his features. "I didn't tell you to make you feel guilty," Emma said, her voice even. "I'm telling you because I'm done keeping secrets to protect other people's comfort. I've had surgery. I've completed radiation. My prognosis is excellent." He dropped his gaze. "Emma, I had no idea." "I know," she said. "That's the point." For the first time, Daniel didn't interrupt. He didn't defend. He just listened. Emma reached for her purse and stood. "I spent half my life as your wife, organizing my world around your ambition, your reputation, your preferences. And when you left, I thought I had lost everything. But I hadn't. I found myself instead." She didn't wait for his reply. She didn't need it. 2 days later, the business news broke. Daniel Walker had resigned from his law firm. The firm's managing partner released a brief statement distancing their leadership from any personal matters involving Mr. Walker. Neutral. Precise. Ruthless. Emma read the article over coffee, then set it aside without comment. The ripple effect reached further than she expected. Friends who had drifted toward Daniel during the divorce began resurfacing. Apologies came wrapped in invitations. Lunches, coffees, catch-ups long overdue. Emma received them with measured grace, but never forgot who had vanished when it counted. Her focus turned inward. It wasn't about vengeance. It was about construction. A new chapter was taking form, brick by brick, with her name, her real name, carved into the foundation. And for the first time in years the ground beneath her felt solid. Spring arrived slowly in Boston, as if testing whether the city was ready to bloom again. For Emma Jenkins, the season brought more than flowers and longer light. It brought clarity. A new rhythm formed in her days. Quiet, steady, and unlike anything she had experienced in her 20-year marriage. She no longer answered to someone else's calendar. She no longer apologized for taking up space. She had come home to herself. 3 weeks after Daniel's fall from grace made its discreet but firm exit from legal circles, Emma received a message from Judith Abernathy. The offer was succinct, confident, and entirely unexpected. Would Emma consider joining her firm as a consultant for nonprofit and estate clients? At first, Emma hesitated. It had been years since she'd touched any formal legal work. Her role for the past 2 decades had been unofficial, planning events, building relationships, managing delicate social politics that always seemed to benefit Daniel's career. But those soft skills, long dismissed as supportive, had become something else. Reputation, leverage, strategy. "You're not being hired as a favor," Judith told her firmly when they met for coffee to discuss the offer. "You're being hired because you're sharp and because you've already done this work under fire. And you did it better than half the men I've trained." Emma didn't smile. She didn't need to. Instead, she nodded and accepted. Her first client was a woman named Nancy, mid-50s, nervous, quietly desperate. She was going through a divorce from a controlling husband who had buried their assets in trust accounts she didn't understand. Emma listened to her story with the same calm she had once used to plan gala fundraisers. Then she spoke slowly, clearly, and with precision. She explained Nancy's legal options, outlined a path forward, and reassured her in a voice that didn't waver. Nancy left that meeting lighter. Emma remained seated afterward, fingers laced loosely in her lap. Something inside her had clicked into place. She wasn't stepping into a new life. She was returning to one she'd never had the chance to finish. Outside the office, her life filled with quiet moments that once felt like luxuries. Morning walks in the public garden, evenings spent reading with the windows open. Claire still dropped by often, sometimes with takeout, sometimes just to sit and share silence. Michael from next door began showing up more frequently too, usually with a casserole or garden advice. He never pressed. Never pried. And Emma didn't mind the company. Occasionally, someone would bring up Daniel. His demotion, the rumors of a move to a smaller firm in Providence, the whispers of his isolation. Emma didn't flinch at the mention of his name. She no longer carried it like a wound. It had become something else. Distant, quiet, unremarkable. One Saturday afternoon, a letter arrived in an envelope with no return address. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable. George Walker. Inside the message was brief. Emma, I've decided to sell the cottage. Too many mixed memories. Enclosed is a key to the garden shed. I thought you might want what's inside. Your grandmother's tools should belong to someone who understands what it means to grow things. George. Emma held the small worn key in her palm for a long time. She knew the shed well. Knew the soft earth around it, the rows of perennials passed down through generations. And though she hadn't stepped foot on that land since the engagement party, something in her stirred, a quiet call toward closure. She made the drive alone the following weekend, following the same winding road she had taken months before. The shutters on the cottage were already peeling under the mountain weather. The sleek white furniture Daniel and Jessica had installed now looked cold and misplaced. The house felt empty in a way that went beyond silence. It had no soul. Inside the shed, dust floated in slants of afternoon light. On a low shelf, wrapped carefully in an old cloth, were her grandmother's garden tools, worn, wooden-handled, the steel darkened but still strong. Beside them, tucked into a sealed box, was a stack of photo albums. Emma opened the top one. Her and Daniel's wedding. Their first Christmas. Their anniversary at Lakeview. George had preserved them all. She took a long breath. Not out of grief, but gratitude. As she turned to leave, she heard the crunch of tires on gravel. She stepped outside and saw Daniel's car pull in slowly. He emerged, dressed simply, jeans, a sweater, no trace of the crisp lawyer she had once known. "Dad said you might be here," he said. "I wanted to return something." He held out a small velvet box. Inside were her mother's earrings, the ones she had believed lost in the divorce. "I should have given these back a long time ago," he said. "I was too angry." "No. I'm just trying to rebuild. Emma nodded. No anger. No affection. Just a quiet acknowledgement. They walked to the dock together and sat, watching the water shimmer beneath the afternoon sun. You know what's strange? Emma said after a while. I don't regret any of it. Not even the end. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I think I'm starting to understand that. And with that they parted. Not as enemies. Not even as exes. But as two people who had survived the same storm, and emerged on separate shores. The following morning, Emma rose early. The cottage remained quiet, the sun just beginning to paint golden strokes across the lake's glassy surface. She stepped barefoot onto the wooden porch, wrapped in a light cardigan, holding a cup of coffee between her palms. The air was still, the kind of silence that follows after a long storm, not the absence of noise but the presence of peace. She spent the early hours packing the items she had collected from the shed, her grandmother's tools, the photo albums George had so carefully preserved, and a few mementos she hadn't realized she still cared about until now. A wind chime on the side of the house clinked softly with each passing breeze. By late morning she had loaded everything into the back of her car. As she closed the trunk, Emma turned for one last look at Lakeview Cottage. The peeling white shutters. The replaced furniture inside that never belonged. The ghost of what it had once been. There was no urge to linger. No sentimentality. She had already said goodbye. As she drove down the winding road, the trees arched above her like a cathedral ceiling, sunlight flashing in broken patterns across the windshield. At a scenic turnout near the edge of the mountain she pulled over. Not for nostalgia. But for clarity. She stepped out and stood at the edge of the overlook. The view stretched endlessly, layers of forest and sky colliding in quiet majesty. Emma took a long breath. This, she realized, was the exact opposite of the life she'd lived for so long. A life of appearances, performances, careful silences. This was space. Real space. She let her thoughts move freely for the first time in years. No longer tethered to Daniel. No longer defined by marriage or betrayal or even victory. Just a woman who had endured something, walked through fire and didn't come out charred, but reshaped. By mid-afternoon, Emma returned to Boston. Her apartment felt different now. Warmer. Lived in. Hers. She unpacked the albums and placed them on a low shelf. The tools from the shed would go in the closet for now, though she already knew she'd use them again. Maybe not for gardening but for something new. Something her hands could build. That evening Claire stopped by with a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. They sat on the balcony watching city lights flicker on one by one. He came, didn't he? Claire asked quietly. Emma nodded. He gave me back Mom's earrings. That was unexpected. Claire tilted her head. Did it help? Seeing him like that? Emma paused before answering. It didn't hurt. Later that night she checked her email and found a message from Nancy, her client from a few weeks ago. The subject line read simply, "We did it." The message inside was a thank you, plain and heartfelt. Emma replied with a few encouraging words, then closed the laptop. She no longer needed applause. The next morning she received a delivery from Judith's office. A formal offer letter, expanding her role to part-time associate. It wasn't a title she had chased. It was one she had earned. She accepted without hesitation. That afternoon she walked through the Boston Public Garden with a sense of quiet purpose. She moved differently now. Shoulders back. Head high. Her steps were unhurried but intentional. And when people passed her on the path she didn't flinch or look away. She belonged to herself. By week's end, Emma returned to Lakeview one last time, not in person but in writing. She sent George a letter. Short, sincere and without drama. She thanked him for the protection he had built into his will. For seeing her even when she didn't see herself. For giving her not just justice but time. Time to become again. George replied a few days later with a postcard. On the back, in his steady, simple handwriting, were 5 words. You were always the heir. That evening, Emma sat at her desk and began writing. Not emails, not legal notes, but her own words. The first line came easily. Sometimes you lose everything, and it's exactly what saves you. She didn't cry. She didn't shake. She just kept writing. Because the story wasn't about destruction anymore. It was about reclamation. And Emma Jenkins was no longer the supporting character. She was the author now. and her story had finally come home. And so Emma's story closes not with revenge but with quiet reclamation. A woman who was discarded, dismissed, and underestimated, yet rose not in fury but in clarity. Through betrayal, illness, and loss, she found something deeper than triumph. A return to self. She didn't just survive the end of her marriage. She rewrote the ending. Not for him. For her. Because sometimes, it isn't the breaking that destroys us. It's what finally lets us rebuild. What would you do if you discovered the power to rewrite your own story? Would you walk away or would you walk back stronger? If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories of strength, healing, and second chances.